The rivalry between the clubs is strong. I mean, even you have your work-in cycle. Sometimes you're strong and sometimes you're not so strong. Yeah. But the rivalry's always there. And one of the beauty of the Newcastle comp, like any comp, one of the beauty of football is unpredictability. If you could predict who was going to win every year, every week, you wouldn't bother going, would you?
Well, I'm joined by Terry Bryden, the Secretary of Central Newcastle Butcher Boys. Welcome to Footy Talk, Terry.
And thank you for having me.
Mate, again, we're here to have a talk about the history of the club, the history of the ground. But first of all, Butcher Boys, how did that come about?
Well, Peter, the Butcher Boys were formed originally in 1910 in Beaumont Street, Hamilton. They were called the Beaumont Street Boys, and the inaugural meeting of the club was held in the Clock Tower building, which still exists in Beaumont Street. As a matter of fact, we put a plaque in that a few years ago to commemorate the forming of Central Newcastle. But in those days, the players had changed from rugby union to rugby league. Rugby league was a new game in 1910. So when they first took the field, they wore rugby union jumpers, and Central colours were blue and white, and the jumpers were a series of wide and thin stripes, similar to a butcher's apron. So hence the name Butcher Boys. 1960, Central Newcastle had their boundaries expanded to include Highfields, Charlestown, Dudley and Redhead. And that way because of that, they inherited another junior organisation called the Charlestown Junior Rugby League Football Club. So the senior club had two junior clubs, one Central Newcastle Rugby League Football Club based in Hamilton, the other one Central Charlestown Junior Rugby League Football Club based here in Charlestown. This is not the original oval. The oval we can see tonight is a revamped, a beautiful complex that was built in a deal done about 7 years ago with the football club, Lake Macquarie City Council and GPT, who wanted to expand Charlestown Square, and as an offset they built this complex. In 1961, three blokes, Jack Harrison, Jack Wood and Eric St John, saw this area, which was just rough scrub in those days, rough bush, as a perfect place to build a first-class rugby league field for the Charlestown area. And that was their dream, but they were determined to make their dream a reality. And Eric St John took the initiative and took almost 4 years battling with the Crown Lands Board to be granted a lease for Central Charlestown Junior Rugby League Club to build a ground on this patch of bush. And that's when the volunteers kicked in. They rallied, they borrowed machinery, they borrowed bulldozers, trucks, scarifiers, tractors, all sorts of stuff. And then they had to teach themselves to drive them, of course, and they cleared the bush, they drained the area, they fenced it, they did everything. The only thing that they didn't do themselves was the final levelling of the ground. That was a specialist job that they entrusted to Lake Macquarie City Council, and they were well pleased with the job they did. After that, volunteers planted grass. They sat out in the hot sun and put the runners in. Then, of course, it had to be watered before the runners took. They even raised enough money to build the grandstand that we're sitting in today. This grandstand is the original grandstand built by the volunteers of that time. The senior body saw the long-term need for a leagues club, and they bought a block of land across the road in Beulah Street, opposite the football field, and decided to build a licensed club. At that time, they had 11 hotels in Newcastle where they sold raffle tickets, which raised the money for the football operation. And there was a very strict roster for footballers. They all had to sell raffle tickets in one of the pubs during the week. Even if they'd played on the Saturday, sometimes they were rostered to sell raffle tickets on Saturday night after a game. You'll never get footballers to do that today. But anyway, at that time, the Beresfield Bowling Club were building a new clubhouse, and Central bought their old clubhouse, cut it into pieces, put it on low loaders and brought it down and assembled it on the land they'd bought across the ground from this oval. They then applied for a liquor licence, and in 1967 the licence club opened. But unfortunately, the week that it was due to open was a brewery strike in New South Wales and there was no beer. So a bloke called Phil Crockett sent one of his works trucks to a brewery in Toowoomba in Queensland to pick up a load of beer. And they drove up there non-stop, loaded up and drove back non-stop to arrive on the morning of the opening of the Leagues Club. So the Leagues Club opening went ahead, and in fact on that day they sold 40 18-gallon kegs of beer. They were 18 gallons in those days. And then they ran out and they had to wait a couple of days before some more beer arrived.
They drank it dry.
They did drink it dry, they did. And there was a funny thing that in those days there was a lot of old-time dancing, and people used to comment on the wonderful sprung dance floor in Central Charlestown Leagues Club. But in fact, talking to some of the old-timers that built the club, they said that when they were doing the dance floor, it got a bit late and it got to beer o'clock. And so they built the floor with half the piers missing, and that was the reason the dance floor was sprung, not by design.
So when you look back, Terry, over the last 50, 60 years, it's fair to say if it wasn't without the volunteers, we may not have what we have today.
No, that would certainly be the case. Without volunteers, this complex would not exist. Yeah. Thousands of hours of volunteer labour to build the football field, and thousands of hours of volunteer labour to build the Leagues Club.
And as we look across the ground, we've got the Brian Cherry press box over there, another treasured volunteer.
He was. Brian Cherry was a stalwart of the junior club. He worked tirelessly to help build this sporting complex. And it's great that he's been remembered with the press box named after him.
And mate, Matt Lantry, what has he done, do you think, for the Butcher Boys this year? He wanted to come here, he wanted to change things. Do you think he's going a long way in doing so?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, Matt Lantry has brought a level of professionalism to our club that we have not seen before. Because with Matt Lantry, you don't just get Matt Lantry, you get a package. You get a package of professionals, stats takers, people that really, really know their business. So, yeah.
Mate, you've been associated with the club for a while. Last week you knocked off Western Suburbs Rosellas. That must have been a bit of a thrill.
Yeah, if you're a long-term central person, you know what it's like to be down the bottom of the ladder. And it's great when you can come out and have hard-fought wins over teams like West and South. Yeah, it's a great feeling. On those nights you go home feeling really, really good.
Well, thanks for joining us on Footy Talk, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jerry.
Peter.